Hello, bonjour, bienvenue, welcome. In this module, I'll review a few of the most useful functions that can be used to look up values in a table of reference data. So the idea here is that if you have a database or a curated data set, you can use functions in Excel to look up values in that table for you and to fill a cell with the result of that search. For example, some of the people that I work with are more familiar with the French terms for Excel functions than the English terms. So just as an example, I gathered over 400 of these terms and I arranged them in two columns, as you can see here. Now, it is always possible to manually look up the French equivalent function of an English function by scrolling down the list. But I hope you can see that because this table is rather large, the manual procedure is somewhat cumbersome. So let me show you how I use the XLOOKUP function to make this easier. By the way, the XLOOKUP function is a modern replacement for HLOOKUP and VLOOKUP. XLOOKUP works in any direction and it doesn't require that the data table be sorted before looking up. So I highly recommend it. First of all, please note that these functions are found on a sheet named Functions, and I created a different sheet that I named Search, where we're going to write our formulas. So here I'm using the cell style preset called Input to indicate to the user that they're supposed to type the function that they're searching for in this cell B1. And in the cell formatted in the output style below, I'm going to enter a formula based on the XLOOKUP function. So equals XLOOKUP. Now this requires that I first specify the lookup value, and that's going to be the contents that we type into cell B1. Then next, we indicate the lookup array. That is, where should Excel search for the term that we've specified in B1? And that is on the functions sheet, A2, click on A2, Control-Shift down arrow all the way to the bottom of that array. And I'm going to tap F4 to make that range absolute. Then we type comma, and now we have to provide the return array. That is, we have to select the range that contains the value to be returned from the search, namely the equivalent value in column B. So we're going to select B2, Control-Shift down arrow, and F4. Now we can provide a value to return if the search term is not found, and that would be useful in our case. So let's provide the text not found. Next, we can optionally provide the search mode, and the exact match mode is what we want in this case, and it's the default. So when we close the function by typing a bracket and hitting return, we return to the cell where we entered the formula, namely B2 on the search sheet. So if we type the English term average, the lookup function returns the French term of moyenne. Now, to make the French to English search, I'm going to copy the contents of cell B2, Control C, and paste it in cell E2, Control V. Now you can see that the relative reference B1 was changed to E1 when we copied it over. That's great. That's what we wanted. And the absolute references didn't change, but they are in the reverse order. So now we have to search in column B and return a value found in column A. And we can do that because XLOOKUP works in any direction. And while we're at it, we might as well change not found to pas trouvé. To test it, let's type sum, and it returns the value sum. So here we have an English to French, French to English dictionary of Excel functions, thanks to application of the function XLOOKUP. In the next example, I want to introduce the functions index and XMATCH. Now, index is used to return a value stored or found in an array of data at the row and column numbers provided to that function. And XMATCH is a function that will look through a row or a column of data for a search term and return the position of that search term in that row or in that column. So the index and XMATCH functions work really well together. So to illustrate how, I made up an example of a table of fictitious teaching data. So this table shows the number of credits taught by each professor, shown down this column, for several different academic years, shown across this row. And on the query sheet, the sheet named query, in the input formatted cells, we would enter the name of the professor and the academic year to search for. Let's type XMATCH and 2020. Now in cell B3, we're going to enter a formula to search for the number of teaching credits that XMATCH taught in 2020. So we'll do this by using the index function. We type index, open bracket, and now we have to specify where the array is found. Where are all the data found? In this case, we click on the data sheet and we select all of the cells of the data range. Starting at B3, Control Shift right arrow, Control Shift down arrow to select the entire array of B3 to H22. Now we type comma, and we have to specify a row number. So here we can use the XMATCH function to find that row number. The XMATCH function requires that we first provide a lookup value, and that's the value that would be found back on the query data sheet, the name of the prof entered into cell B1. Then we have to specify the lookup array, namely, where are we looking up the name of this prof? That would be back on the data sheet in cells A3, Control Shift down arrow to A22. Then we close the XMATCH function, hit comma, and now we have to provide the column number to the index function. Here we would use another XMATCH function, this time matching the academic year specified in cell B2 on the sheet named query, and looking for this academic year in the lookup array found on the data sheet in cells B2, Control Shift right arrow over to H2. Now when we close the XMATCH function with a bracket and close the index function with a bracket, when we hit return, Excel returns us to the cell where we were entering this formula, namely B3, and we can see that Simard taught 6 credits in the year 2020. And if we change this name to McLeod, we can see that we can very quickly search another professor to see the number of credits that they taught in that year. Now, I know the resulting formula seems long, with 2 XMATCH functions nested within an index function, but conceptually this is rather simple. We use the index function to search for a value in an entire array. Then we use an XMATCH function to provide the row number in that array, and another XMATCH function to provide the column number in that array. So index and XMATCH work really well together in this way.